Welcome to GreenKnight. I'm working on this message that I've been working on, I guess, my whole life. Intuitively, you know how when you have an awakening, it's intuitive, you can't put words to it. But since I've been talking and writing so long about this, it's finally becoming comprehensive. And perhaps comprehensible. Right? It's up to you guys on that one. Obviously, I think it's important. Otherwise, I wouldn't be saying this, but words won't do the thing that is required, right, for humanity. This is what this is about, right? But words are a part of it. And so someone has to say this. Someone has to say it. And so can you handle it? Or can you not, right? I guess we're going to find out. The cycle of distorted recursion, right? That's the title of this piece, right? The cycle of distorted recursion, perception, reality, and the path to interdependence. The hidden flaw in modern models of reality. Modern models of reality are built on the assumption that objectivity excludes the perceiver from the whole, meaning the modeler, the observer. The interpreter of reality must be excluded for objectivity to be preserved, whether in a scientific framework or the conditioning that shapes our everyday view of the world. The default assumption is the condition that the perceiver must be separate from what is perceived. This exclusion, though, creates an unnatural starting point, because a reality without a perceiver can only exist as a mental construct. Without a witness, it can only be imagined, right? Because if an independent reality did exist, it could never be confirmed without an awareness of it. This creates a reality that can only be maintained by the mind, which is what we have done. And we experience it as if it were the real world. Although we experience this imagined separation as normal, it is fabricated. Nature responds to this fabricated division by maintaining unity at a cost. When the mind models everything but excludes itself, it creates a recursion in which the missing modeler becomes the endless object of its own search. This produces a distorted recursion, a loop with no stable endpoint because the initial condition can never be accounted for, which is the division, right? The division of perception, the modeler, the observer. Our civilization's recursion begins from the division of perception as a condition for truth, but truth does not require such a condition. Truth is not a destination that can be reached in finality. It is an ongoing endeavor. Truth exists in coherence, a consistent pairing with reality as it is, which cannot exclude the perceiver. When positions or viewpoints are claimed as separate, they trigger their own counterpositions. This dynamic maintains indivisibility through opposition. This is the cost, binding the two sides together in opposition rather than allowing them to interact dynamically. It's like cutting a magnet in half, right? Instantly, the two halves generate a set of two new magnets. Two new poles, right? But knowledge is accessible, right? Verified information need not occupy a position at all, and therefore does not require a counterposition. For example, the theory of structure, right? Post and lintel building technique. It works without triggering opposition because it has been confirmed in practice through shared perception. The division of perception is not needed to verify information. In fact, it is this imposed division that creates the recursion, the distorted recursion, the pattern our civilization continually repeats. The idea is that what is true with the absence of perception indicates that it is true in spite of anyone perceiving it, observing it. But there is no way to find out what is true without perception. So we simulate it. Right? We simulate its absence by identifying what is true for everyone. The assumption is that shared perception, true for all observers, is equal to perception not being present, right? Perception independence, observer independence. But these two things are not reversible, right? You can't go back and forth from these things, right? One does not mean the other. The absence of perception, something undetected, not perceived, unverified by perception, can only be constructed in the mind, right? Can only be mentally constructed. The condition for truth itself, right? The separation of perception cannot be detected. It can only be imagined, right? And simulated. This is the epistemological paradox, the approach to the acquisition of knowledge, right? Epistemological, that means the theory of the acquisition of knowledge, right? It contains within it a paradox, which is exactly what we're talking about. So the idea is to avoid the contradiction, right? The approach to the acquisition of knowledge, therefore, should not be separation, right? It should be sustaining the avoidance of separated positioning when engaging in the addition of new information by starting with the inclusion of perception and not its exclusion. So the inclusion of perception does not have to be imagined. This requires, though, a reflexive coherence, a continual alignment of new information with the whole, recognizing that the verification process requires the collective working in conjunction, not in opposition. Recursion and the cycle of civilization. Recursion in itself is natural, right? The universe exhibits fractal geometry, patterns in which each new form is generated by feeding the output of one stage back into the process as the input for the next, right? This is the definition of recursion. These recursive structures begin with simple interactions that lead to high complexity, creating the rich variety of forms and systems we see in nature. In healthy recursion, each iteration builds on the integrity of the whole. The recursion of human civilization, however, begins with a false assumption. Reality exists independent of perception. This distorted starting point creates a semi-alternate reality that can be maintained only in the mind because a world independent of perception is not possible in practice. By beginning there, the system inevitably produces contradiction, because the mind is part of reality whether or not it is acknowledged. Nature's coherence is unbroken, but the model of separation generates a loop that can never be resolved because it attempts to sustain a division that cannot exist. Are y'all with me? Right, let's keep going. Mathematics, with its precision and reproducibility, appears to promise a framework detached from perception, right? Its reproducibility. Anyone who does it gets the same result, right? That's why it's so powerful. Yet, Gödel's incompleteness theorem reveals that mathematics cannot be both complete and consistent, and its conclusions rest entirely on chosen starting premises. These are not drawn from an ultimate truth, but selected by human minds, which means mathematics, too, is bound to self-reference, right? Since empirical science relies on mathematics to formalize and test its models, it inherits the same structural limitation. The scientific method's apparent neutrality is therefore not absolute. Its success reinforces the false condition that truth can be established apart from perception. Despite this foundational blind spot, empirical science does work, because what it really does is coordinate multiple perspectives to produce stable intersubjective patterns. Right? When multiple observers perceive the same result, it doesn't prove that perception plays no role. It only shows that perception can be mutually calibrated to form a consensus. However, right? Verification via consensus or broad agreement does not resolve the contradiction, does not terminate the recursive loop, Empiricism confuses shared perception with perception-independent reality and uses the former to pretend the latter has been secured. But when the starting premise, an independent observer, is fed back into the framework for interpreting new information, the contradiction between dependence and claimed independence retains the distortion. It keeps trying to account for what is missing, but cannot find closure because what it needs is excluded. The cycle is embodied in the pattern of systemic paradigm shift, exhibited in the world of science and broadly in the pattern of civilization itself. When a position is claimed as separate, it becomes an asserted position, a framework that is presented as distinct from all else. This distinct position claims independence, which cannot exist, and so triggers a counterposition that maintains its relationship with the world, right? The independence cannot exist, and so instantly triggers a counterposition that maintains its dependence. This gives rise to opposing views that define themselves by negating each other. Each position calls its opposite into being, locking them into a closed, dichotomical interaction. Society has long been operating in a consensus-based construct where what the majority accepts functions as truth regardless of whether it reflects the whole of reality. Once a paradigm is entrenched, it resists contradictory evidence. There is an overarching effort to maintain the established consensus because contradiction leads to instability and the eventual failure of the system model. Ironically, this is also the case for scientific paradigms and demonstrates clearly how the error of the premise of division persists despite epistemic refinement. In science, outdated models are defended despite compelling data that challenges them. Identities become entangled with specific viewpoints, and preserving those identities takes precedence over aligning with reality. The result is a culture locked into defending separation, unable to fully engage with the integrated nature of existence. The insistence on maintaining the condition of separation leads us to a knowledge barrier that cannot be crossed without acknowledging perception as an intrinsic ontological component of reality. So that's the problem, right? Here's the solution. The interdependent observer, right? As opposed to independent. The interdependent observer is not separate from the system they observe, but a living expression of it. Their perspective is shaped by the same conditions they study, removing the illusion of an external vantage point. This is not a weakness, but a resolution of the false independence that fuels distorted recursion. In most scientific and philosophical traditions, the observer is treated as though they can be excluded from the model to protect it from subjective bias. Yet exclusion does not remove perception. It conceals it, embedding separation into the foundation of the model. This starting assumption becomes self-fulfilling, ensuring that subjectivity shapes every result. It mistakes shared perception for proof of a perception-independent reality, creating a fixed standpoint, a perspective that filters and distorts new information, which is exactly what it was intended to prevent. Interdependent observation, on the other hand, corrects this distortion by abandoning the stance of being outside the whole. Including perception does not weaken truth. It resolves the contradiction and ends the loop, allowing the model to reflect the whole rather than a divided abstraction. This inclusion fulfills the very aim of the condition of separation, preventing the contamination of perspective by not allowing previous knowledge to be a fixed lens through which every new observation must be made, and instead permitting each observation to be met directly. The observer is not located at a detached point, but is distributed within the whole of the system that is being observed. And this distribution is achieved by permitting the observer to be the whole of the collective. Each individual provides a key component of the whole of the collective's power of perception, which in combination provides a distributed, positionless, non-local awareness with which to observe accurately. Knowledge arises as internal resonance, not an external audit, resolving the contradiction and avoiding the automatic formation of oppositional dichotomies. Including perception strengthens truth by enabling change without loss of integrity. Integrity rests on relational consistency rather than fixed positions, allowing truth to be pursued without triggering the cycle that turns the quest for understanding into conflict. An interdependent observer is thus the clearest expression of the system, deepening what is known precisely because prior knowledge does not distort the reception of new information. Critics may claim that Gödel's incompleteness theorem applies only to formal mathematical systems, not to empirical models of the natural world, and that using it here commits a category error. Yet empirical models cannot function without mathematics. Mathematics, with its reproducibility and precision, appears to promise independence from perception, but Gödel demonstrated that mathematics is incomplete, its conclusions bounded by starting assumptions rather than flowing from a universal source of truth. If even our most exact tool cannot escape self-reference, no formulation of reality can claim independence. Others may argue that in science consensus is provisional and can be overturned by new evidence, so majority belief does not function as truth. Right? That's how science is supposed to work. But historical evidence suggests otherwise. Science has become as dogmatic as any generalized belief system. Paradigm shifts in science are often delayed for decades because those invested in the old framework resist or suppress contradictory evidence. Examples include the persistence of string theory, despite its lack of empirical confirmation, and the marginalization of archaeologists whose findings challenge the accepted historical timeline. Right? These are not failures of data, but a failure to include data from the basis of identity. Attachment to a framework becomes a defense of self. This is the greatest irony. The condition in attempting to remove the contamination of perspective enforces the contamination because it assumes a fixed external viewpoint, which influences how things are seen. Some argue that acknowledging perception as an ontological component of reality leads to relativism or solipsism. In fact, it is its exclusion that presumes those outcomes, right? The condition presumes those outcomes and spends its energy suppressing them, right? The inclusion of perception in the formulation of reality is not relativism, since it does not claim all perspectives are equally valid. And it is not solipsism, since it affirms the existence of a shared world that can be coherently explored, not a multitude of separate worlds built from every set of eyes. Interdependence preserves the capacity to verify, replicate, and refine understanding while keeping these processes within the reality they describe. The universe exhibits coherence. It exists, yet becomes knowable only through observation. Observation introduces decoherence as lived experience, an environment that seems locally real, and this complements the entirety, which is non-local. Awareness and what exists move together as a polarity. Perspective is relational, not separate and external. Relationship includes all things. Subject and object, self and other, perception and reality are polar relationships. Denying one negates the other, right? Negates the whole. Both of them create the whole. One without the other is not definable. Recognizing this does not weaken truth. It prepares the ground for it, since unity can be maintained without provoking the unavoidable relationship in the form of opposition. All right, that's part one. So this is part 2. Are you still with me? Now we talk about breaking the cycle and the civilizational pattern of opposition. The belief that perception and reality can stand apart is not merely a philosophical error. It is a structural distortion. Once embedded in models and institutions, it forces the unity it denies to reassert itself through conflict. Each asserted position summons its counterposition, and the field collapses into two hardened sides. Conflict maintains a brittle unity rather than a living one, and each resolution seeds the next opposition. This binary framework recycles division under new names, sustaining conflict as the primary mode of cohesion. When the claim of independence is taken as a premise, society relies on the institution of shared perception to substitute for truth. Consensus becomes a proxy for reality, and authority structures arise to guard that proxy. Right? When the claim of independence is taken as a premise, society relies on the institution of shared perception to substitute for truth. Consensus becomes a proxy for reality, and authority structures arise to guard that proxy. Over time, the social order drifts into a semi-alternate reality sustained by belief rather than direct engagement with the whole. But this loop is not inevitable. It can be broken by replacing false independence with interdependence as the primary orientation. Interdependence recognizes human society as a unified field mirroring the wider universe, sustaining unity without opposition, where consensus does not need to be established and protected, but is implicit from the start as an array of collected human beings that form a unified perception apparatus as one through which what is known is constantly being updated. This is the process of learning, and being human means this learning takes place through the continued exchange of value with others. When separation interrupts this flow, it limits participation, constrains potential, and risks trapping humanity in a self-perpetuating loop that slowly erodes the creative potential, the creative capacity to learn until it is lost entirely. That is the risk we face. Humanity's natural state is not a fractured and halting mode of operation. The root cause of this pattern is the imaginary condition of division, and it must be eliminated. For this to occur, each of us must know ourselves. The notion of self-knowledge has been co-opted. What is missed is that the aggregate of all interactions creates the pattern of our civilization. Right? It is the average of all of our relationship interactions that creates the pattern of our civilization. The condition of separation suggests that the world is as it is despite perception. But everyone is culpable for the state of the world because perception creates the state of the world. What we believe becomes operatively true, right? Whether it's true or not, right? We do create our own reality in the most mundane sense. It's not anything magical. There is nothing external that can be addressed. The system cannot be fixed. Right? There is nothing external that can be addressed when the internal state of each individual informs their interactions with the outside world. The external pattern alters only when the condition that guides the relationship of the world dissolves, right? The condition of separation, right? This is the human condition. As opposed to human nature, they're not the same thing, right? A condition is treatable, right? Without the condition, the defense of an independent sense of self falls away, and every interaction takes place from an integrated, distributed perspective. The mistake that we make is that the idea of knowing oneself has been equated with becoming well-adjusted to a fractured society. as if there is no other choice. This is still externalization. It is not an adjustment to one's internal state of being. It says all is well if I am well. However, one's personal situation being good does nothing to prevent the repetition of the cycle, right? We've been doing this for thousands of years, right? Your legacy doesn't prevent the cycle from continuing, and if it does continue, there's a serious risk of a negative outcome, right? So this is the real controlled opposition, right? Know thyself, right? It has been co-opted. No matter what worldview one adheres to, right? The cycle persists. To know thyself is knowing that there is no self without relationship, that the self cannot exist without the other, that there is no change in remaining separate, no matter what the content of your thoughts are. If you retain this separation, there is no change. The change is knowing that each of us is the whole thing. And knowing that not just conceptually, right? You have to know, right, that you are the whole thing, right? Interdependently, through relationship. And knowing that, right? Not just conceptually, but knowing it at a soul level, one's relationship changes at the core, and then the whole thing changes. It is put back together, is restored, is remembered, right? The Rumi quote, yesterday I was clever, so I wanted to change the world. Today I am wise, so I am changing myself. It takes on a fresh and more accurate meaning now, right? It's not taboo to want to change the world, but you can't change it out there. You have to change yourself, and then out there changes. But it's not an individual, it's an individual thing, but the pattern won't change until we all make this transformation. That's why it's so difficult. Beginning from the natural arrangement, interdependent relationship, the shift is initiated with first principles, right? Beginning from the natural arrangement, interdependent relationship, the shift is initiated with first principles. Human life depends on a continual flow of value between people, the people that make up the human network, right? The facilitation of this flow can be created and maintained without fixed identities or camps, without becoming a member of any thought group, right? Thinking for yourself, right? But knowing that you are part of a vast array, a perception array that includes everyone. The prioritization of the natural value exchange between people would permit humanity to rejoin its original state and reset the pattern of civilization. Building an exchange network designed for accessibility, transparency, and coherence would offer the correct environment for this transformation. Such a network would maximize the dialectic process of idea exchange without turning differences into battlegrounds, replacing authority-enforced consensus with the living stability of reflexive coherence among interdependent observers. The practical framework for interdependence. If the cycle of distorted recursion is to be broken, there must be a practical way for individuals and communities to actualize and live interdependence, not simply understand it as a concept. Philosophy alone cannot shift the underlying condition if daily life still operates according to the false division between awareness and reality. What is required is an infrastructure for people to interact with as an option to the existing system, right? If there's nowhere to go, people won't go, right? This network, once given form, will exponentialize the value generation potential naturally available to humanity. An infrastructure that clearly demonstrates interdependence as tangible, repeatable, and rewarding. This exchange network would restore coherence between contribution and reception across all domains of human creativity. It is not merely a marketplace for goods and services, nor is it a redistribution mechanism. It is the living expression of the principle that being human means participating in the shared creation of value. Every contribution, whether physical, intellectual, or cultural, is recognized as part of a unified flow, and every reception of value strengthens the whole. The foundation of this network is accessibility. The first pillar is that all people must be able to contribute and receive without barriers of wealth, status, or institutional gatekeeping. This requires transparent methods for recognizing value, not only in economic terms, but in the broader context of well-being, cultural depth, and shared knowledge. Coherence is the second pillar, ensuring that what one gives and what one receives are mutually relevant, clearly indicating being inseparable from the whole. This coherence emerges reflexively, not from imposed authority, much as ecosystems sustain balance through ongoing interaction. The third pillar is transparency. The network's processes, from recognizing value to facilitating exchanges, must be visible and understandable to all the participants. This prevents the concentration of control and ensures no authority can position itself within the network for its own power. Trust is built through clarity, accountability, and direct experience of interdependent exchange. In practice, this exchange network, the working title is Polarity Exchange, embodies these principles through interconnected layers, foundational ontology, formalizing the indivisibility of awareness and reality into open standards, distributed agent systems to guide and align exchanges, decentralized protocols enabling peer-to-peer communication, verifiable value transfer, and identity without centralized control, federated knowledge graphs recording contributions and insights while preserving privacy and data sovereignty, open interfaces for mapping value flows and enabling reflection, and recursive governance ensuring continual adaptation through feedback. The network grows in stages, from community formation and prototype agents to a minimum viable exchange platform to a decentralized global federation linking diverse networks. Its evolution is shaped by participation, revealing its form through the lived process of overcoming obstacles and building on successes. Through accessibility, coherence, transparency, and adaptive architecture, the exchange network becomes both the medium and the model for the shift to interdependence. It replaces the illusion of unity enforced by consensus with living unity generated through ongoing exchange. This re-roots society in the ontological fact that separation is impossible, aligning daily life with the reality of interdependence and dissolving the structural conditions that sustain cycles of opposition. Are you with me? This one was tricky to get out. I had so many difficulties, technical difficulties, timing, a neighbor with the chainsaw, and I don't mind birds, but the chainsaw is a little hard on the audio, And so, you can see why I think this is important, right? But what is important? Nothing and everything, right? And so in order to make this internal change, right, we have to stop thinking that we are so important, right? But when you do that, right, when you realize that there is no self without the relationship, right, without other, then you become unlimited, right? So your own sense of self and your sense of will is a limitation, right? When you relinquish those boundaries of where you define yourself to be, right, you become unlimited. And when we all do that, right, we unshackle the potential of our civilization, right? So it's like we all want to, our ego wants to define what we are, right? But we are the whole thing. And when we become that, we become unlimited. And so your ego, you can like kind of convince yourself to do it because your ego would be like, ooh, I like unlimited. What is this limited bullshit, right? And so if you've ever had a peak experience, right, whether in athletics, art, or when you're performing or anything, right, you are at your best when you're not there, right? When your sense of self is dissolved, your performance ability goes through the roof, right? And that's what this is about. And so we don't change the world by trying to change something out there. We change ourselves, right? And then the world changes. But that has been misunderstood because we all have to do it because it is the aggregate. It is the aggregate, right? It is the average of all of us doing this that creates the pattern. So that's how we change the external pattern.